Hello and welcome. I'm Lucia, Rahilly, Editorial Director at McKinsey & Company, and your host for this series of live webinars sponsored by the Global Thought Leadership Institute at APQC. Quick note before we start, this series is designed to give you the opportunity to engage with some of the foremost leaders and practitioners in the field of thought leadership today. We hold these webinars on a monthly cadence, and you can see our roster by visiting APQC's website at apqc.org/GTLI, or by following the GTLI on LinkedIn, which you should all go and do. We've got some great folks coming up, including a panel featuring leaders from Phronesis in May, as well as Jeff Pundyke from Deloitte in June. Deloitte is capturing an increasing share of voice in Tier 1 media people, so you will want to hear what Jeff has to say and how he's working his magic at Deloitte. We would love, love, love for this session to be as interactive as possible. We want to make this genuinely audience-backed and useful. So we invite you, please, to send along your questions using the Zoom chat functionality, and I will do my best to field as many of them as possible. Today, Sam Martin. Sam is the Global Editorial Director for Gensler, which is the world's largest architecture and design firm. He spent more than 25 years as a writer and editor across the full complement of formats, old, new, books, podcasts, social blogs, and back again. And he has led not just content, but interestingly, digital and brand and social strategy in a diversity of contexts. So lots to learn. And again, feel free to use that chat functionality to ask about whatever you're interested in. Sam, welcome. Great to see you.
Thanks, Lucia, for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I'm really looking forward to the chat.
Yep, thanks for being together with us today. We are excited to have you. Let's start with some context. Sam, tell us a little bit about your background and how you landed on thought leadership, this kind of research-driven publishing racket that we're all in.
That's a great way to describe it. My career has been, it's been a winding road, that's for sure. I started out as a journalist, writing for newspapers, and then I moved into the magazine world, where I was an editor at places like This Old House magazine in New York. My beat was always visual design, visual arts, design, architecture. And I suppose it was, and then I began to play around with the idea of ghostwriting. I did some books, and that led me to my entree into this world, which is in about 2007, I was introduced to the chief marketing officer of Frog Design, who was looking for someone to write a book with their founder, the legendary product designer Hartmut Esslinger, who worked with Steve Jobs on the Apple IIc computer back in the early 80s. And so I wrote a book with Hartmut, and it was really sort of, that's when it sort of opened the idea of design, sort of what design is, made me realize that design isn't just an aesthetic pursuit, it's actually a problem solver, a strategic approach to challenges that businesses face, right? And so, and then after that, I was hired on to be the senior editor, quote unquote, senior editor of Frog Design. And I remember, looking at my boss saying like, well, what do you think that means? And he's like, well, I'm not sure yet. Why don't we start a blog, And so that's how that got going. And then, one thing led to another. And here I am at Gensler. And it's been about 7 years here as the editorial director at Gensler. And I think, our challenges are unique because, and we'll get into that, but there's a lot to dive into in terms of thought leadership at Gensler, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that. Before we do, let's just stick a little bit to your background. We have seen journalism obviously increasingly disrupted in recent years, and we, at least at McKinsey, are basically inundated now with former journalists looking for shelter in a way that was much less the case some years back. What do you think the primary difference is between thought leadership and journalism, given that you've had this background in your past? If you were speaking to folks who are either looking for journalism talent, looking for thought leadership talent, or coming off track over onto the thought leadership side?
For sure. It's interesting you say that. There are a lot of former journalists on my team at Gensler, and I think that's a very good thing. I think the biggest difference is that thought leadership is in service to some brand or business outcome, right? And so, whereas in journalism, you're trying to be as objective as possible, you're trying to present a point of view, actually, you're not trying to present a point of view, you're trying to present the facts. So that people can draw their own conclusions. But there are qualities of journalism that we bring into thought leadership at Gensler. Being curious, putting on that reporter's hat, calling people, interviewing folks, really, and pushing people, scrutinizing others' ideas so that you can, get unique ones. So all of that stuff, all of that training, that journalistic training comes in handy. But you do have to understand that what you're trying to do as a part of a marketing team, usually here at Gensler, that's what it is. You're trying to get new business for the brand and for the company. So I think that's the biggest difference. And we flip back and forth, right? So there are times in the cycle where we're like, we need to be journalists now. We need to go out there and find new ideas and interview people and stuff like that. But then there are times where, when we're polishing things up, that we really have to be really aware of how we're actually growing the firm.
And you mentioned that you are part of the marketing group. You've also led on brand strategy in the past. As you said, thought leadership has a marketing purpose to it to some degree. What are the points of intersection and divergence, in your view, between thought leadership and brand in particular?
That's such a great question. So at Gensler, we are a content-driven marketing function. Content is at the core of what we do. And you could make the argument that that's also our brand strategy, right? So when we go to market, we're doing it thinking that we need to educate, our clients. I think brand in itself can mean lots of different things. We're actually having this conversation right now. Brand can mean like we need to redesign the logo. We need to have different colors. There's a whole, brand architecture. And I think that's the difference, right? So when you're talking about brand and when you're trying to build a brand, there are many other things you need to think about. When you're talking about thought leadership and that function, I think it's a pretty specific idea. And so that's more about storytelling and top of the funnel, type of marketing.
Okay, let's talk in a little bit more detail now about the role of thought leadership at Gensler in particular. So as I've said to you before, I find this context for doing thought leadership especially interesting and potentially relatable to folks in the audience, because not everyone works in a consulting firm like I do, where institutes actually constitute the primary currency of what we do. There's a relatively clear translation of what we do as a firm to what we publish. Gensler's value chain may start with ideas, right, and with problem solving, but in many cases the output must be visual and visible and tangible spaces, right? Offices, floors, buildings, the built environment. So how do you, and you spoke to this a little bit when you invoked problem solving, but what is the value to Gensler of doing thought leadership?
So so this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about working with Hartmut and having a bigger understanding of design, right? Design is not just an aesthetic pursuit, right? And I think that's at the core of why we do thought leadership at Gensler. Oftentimes, when you think about architecture, you think automatically of spaces, right? And of buildings. But we actually don't. Our thought leadership is not about geometry. It's really about the experience of place, right? And so how do people what is someone's experience when they're in an airport? How do they flow through the airport? What's their experience when they visit a hotel? How do we go to work and what do we need at work? And all of these ideas are what we try to capture in our thought leadership. We actually think that the design of a space is can offer strategic business value to our clients. And we have to explain that to our clients, right? Far more than needing to explain to them, the details of the actual architecture. It's interesting because once we can, and so I would say that 80% of our thought leadership is about the strategic value that design brings to a client. We do often end, one of the things we try to do in our thought leadership is provide practical advice. And so oftentimes our thought leadership will end in order to give your workers what they need to be productive, these are the design solutions you should be thinking about. So really that's the core of it, right? And I'm happy to give some examples there, but there are other things too that we can get into. The idea of wellness real estate is really interesting, right? We know from our research that buildings that are designed with wellness elements, whether that's an in-office gym or biophilia or open windows or outdoor space, we know that this actually increases the value of a building, of a space. The same, and then there's this.
Hang on. Before you move on, you have to define for our audience biophilia, Sam.
Biophilia. Biophilia is literally the practice of bringing nature inside a building. So like actually plants and greenery inside a building.
Yeah, the Ford Foundation.
That's right.
In Manhattan is like an old example of that, right? There's effectively like a forest in the middle of
and Gensler actually did the renovation on the Ford Foundation, the most renovation. Yeah. So we redesigned that's their headquarters, right? And yes, the classic outdoor enclosed sort of green space is something that we rethought to give, inclusive access and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's what biophilia is. And there's more to it than just bringing plants inside. It is having like more outdoor space and indoor-outdoor access.
Okay, so when you're writing about all this, who is your target audience? Is it largely your specific set of clients? Like how do you construe your target when you're doing thought leadership at Gensler?
So the business that we're in is a relationship-driven business, right? So unlike many management consulting firms, we actually don't have a business development center, right? Our architects are the ones that are out there getting business. We have and we're super proud of this, an incredibly loyal set of clients. We've had one client that's been with us since our start in 1965, for example. And so there's relationship building, there's relationship nurturing, right? So that's one type of client, but it's different for each business. Gensler has 34 different practice areas. These are the verticals in which we do business, right? From universities to hospitals to different kinds of workplaces, to hotels and so on. And so the audiences are slightly different for each one. Generally speaking, we're talking to real estate decision makers. And sometimes those people are in the HR function, right? So chief human resource officers are really interested in how they can make sure that employees have well-being, that they can be productive, that they are engaged, right? And we think that design actually can spur engagement, can actually increase productivity and that sort of thing. So CHROs, especially for our workplace content, is the type of audience we're looking for.
That's super interesting. Okay, I want to get a little more into that. But before we do, couple more questions, just sort of at a high level. Is the audience for Gensler is a huge firm. Again, it's the largest architecture and design firm. It's global, presumably. And it feels like ideas about how and where to live and work can be very culturally specific. How much do you have to tailor your content for regional markets, or are you just going global, generally speaking?
No, our goal is to tailor to, we like to talk about being hyper local. Now, whether or not we can actually do that is another question. I think that's our biggest challenge. You know, we have 57 offices around the world. We do business in 100 countries, and it's not reasonable to think, nor is it actually strategically smart to be a global, large company all the time. The reason we have people in London or in Paris or in Shanghai or in Sydney is because those people actually understand that market, and they need thought leadership and content that speaks to that market, that is
Mhm.
from and by those people. So that's another challenge that we can talk about. And what we found actually is that when we do get hyperlocal, right, when we talk about Penn Station and the infrastructure around Penn Station,
Mhm.
we can tell a boost in our metrics when we think about that thought leadership. And so I'm not
Penn
sure I answered
Station
your.
was an unbelievable. I have to say, the new Penn Station is
Yeah,
like jaw drop. It's such a transformation. The sort of
it's gorgeous.
Moynihan Penn
Yeah,
ecosystem there. Anyway, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. So we think a lot about regionally, and so like Gensler is also it's we have 10 regions around the world, and each of our regions has a marketing and PR function. And oftentimes, those are the people that I work directly with to do thought leadership, right?
Mhm.
So it's not like me and my team have, we produce a lot of globally relevant content and thought leadership, but in order to get more specific and more targeted and segmented, we lean on our regions and work directly with them to get this sort of hyperlocal content.
Mhm.
I'm
And
not gonna. Mhm.
how big is your actual shop at the center?
We are about 21 people,
Mhm.
right? So fairly small.
Yeah.
And I said that, we've got people in each region at our larger offices in cities like New York, Los Angeles, London. Those offices will have their own marketing and PR teams
Mhm.
on their own. So because they do so much business.
Yeah, sure. Okay, you mentioned that you have been at Gensler for roughly 7 years or approaching 7 years.
Yeah.
How has the thought leadership program evolved during that time? Did it even have, was there a thought leadership, did you found it? Was there a nascent thought leadership program when you joined? Was it already thriving? How has it changed in that period?
There was a thought leadership program when I arrived. It was, I'm not even going to call it nascent, but it was wild. It was all over the place. It was very disorganized, right? So there's been a culture of thought leadership at the firm for a long time. And I think that's because we started the Gensler Research Institute about 20 years ago. And the Research Institute is a separate entity from the Marketing Institute, and they do surveys and we have our own sort of IP in a variety of different subjects, and we work very, very closely with them.
Mhm.
And so there had been a culture of thought leadership when I arrived, but as I said, it was a little bit all over the place. It certainly was not directed. And they were publishing on a site separate from Gensler.com. And so what I did was to basically get it under control, make it more organized. We introduced an editorial calendar. We moved our publishing onto the main Gensler.com site. We began to get more rigorous with how we produced and executed on thought leadership. Bringing in journalists like we were talking about earlier, um, um, actually slowing people down, making sure that we're not publishing the same story over and over again, and trying to improve the quality of the thought leadership. And I would say that's been the main thing that I've tried to do. And then of course measuring it, because it was and I'm not going to pretend that we're very good at that, but there was no attempt to measure it before I arrived. And so yeah, that's some of the things. So now we feel like we've kind of gotten a handle on the volume. We still have an incredible volume. I think it's a different kind of challenge from not having enough. We have about 172 different contributors just to the blog alone every year.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow, that's a lot. So it's interesting because I would think in a firm like Gensler's, there might be a challenge engaging folks actually to author thought leadership rather than, doing their day jobs. And I was thinking I should ask you, like, is there an incentive structure in place? Did you have to put one in place? But it sounds like no, you have more demand perhaps than supply. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. Well, architects like to think they're really
Yeah,
good writers, and so
of
um,
course.
so they like to contribute a lot. I do think, and I know that there is an incentive, when architects have their annual reviews or whatever it is they do, they are encouraged to do thought leadership. It is a part of our business, and the fact that the architects are the ones actually doing the deals, so it makes sense for them to do thought leadership.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it's a different kind of challenge. We don't have any shortage of content. I will say, and this is the challenge that I put forward to all of our thought leaders in the firm and to my team, is that we need to improve the quality. So if you're asking me, do we have we might have, 200 pieces of thought leadership every year. How much of that is quality? That's a different conversation. And I think by quality, I mean, we have to be provocative at times. We can't tell the same story over and over again. We have to find different formats to put our thought leadership into. And so this is the big push right now. And then the more global we get and the more we move into these global markets, that's going to become even more important. And so if we have a huge volume of content now, I would say 80% of it has a US lens, and we need to
Mhm.
change that and flip the script.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned establishing metrics and measuring success. What are you using to measure the impact of your thought leadership?
So this is an ongoing conversation. One of the things that I got excited about at the symposium earlier this year with the Global Thought Leadership Institute was, this idea of the ROI of thought leadership, uh, and so we all know better than most how difficult it is. We use and have for a long time a variety of sort of analytics measures. That's mostly what we do. We are now beginning to try to link it to our CRM, and the closest we get right now is that we know there are some people who end up signing on the dotted line, or whatever you want to say, that actually do read our thought leadership in their journey. And so there's a correlation. We have not yet landed on a causation, like in other words, and we get idea. I mean, we get input, right? We get this sort of people say like, oh, I got a call because someone read this blog or design forecast, and they want to move forward with a project. So we get that kind of anecdotal evidence, but that's about it right now.
Yeah, we call that our anecdata.
Oh, that's good.
We collect all of that as much as we can in an operationalized way from authors, but it is difficult to, because some authors track it more diligently than others. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Um, Okay, so I would love to get a little bit, and just before I do, you mentioned the ROI of thought leadership. For folks who didn't attend our symposium, you should rush to Amazon and purchase the ROI of thought leadership, which is a fantastic book on measuring the value of what we do by Cindy Anderson and Anthony Marshall from IBM's Institute for Business Value. It's just come out and it's incredible. So very useful to practitioners in this field. So let's get into this cool bit about sort of trends in the content at Gensler. You mentioned a couple, and you mentioned this idea of CHROs being part of your target, which is interesting because we are undergoing ourselves the phenomenon of return to office, and that's been a headline, I think, for many folks in the US. And this idea of collaborating in real life has become so elusive, even as we return to office. You know, I'll go in and sit there, but often I'm commuting in and just Zooming with folks in geographically disparate cities, or, you know, maybe I don't go in and I'm at home because my kids are on school break. So I'm interested in either this or other topics that you find are resonating right now with your clients.
Yeah. The workplace conversation is a fascinating one, and you're right. There's a lot of people going back to the office. So we've been doing workplace research for 20 years. Our first U.S. workplace survey came out in 2005, and we continue to do them every year. And what we've found is that what people actually want from the office is to get their work done, right? And so it's not only about collaboration. In fact, 40% of the people who go into the office say they're going in because they need some focus time or some quiet time to actually get their work done and to be productive. And so the biggest trend we're seeing right now is one around choice. So what is the most effective workplace? The most effective workplace is one where, number one, you don't have an assigned desk, and number two, you can choose from different neighborhoods or areas in the workplace based on what you need to get done that day. So if you need heads down, then there might be a quiet part of the office, or a booth that you can sit in where no one's going to disturb you. If you need to get together with the team and collaborate on something, then you should have the right space to do that in too, with the right technology, right? And a lot of people have talked, there's been a lot of talk about the social aspect of the workplace. And I think that's true, but when you survey people, coming to the office to be social is actually, third or fourth on the list. It's not as important as everybody makes it out to be. The bottom line is that the workplace needs to be a place where you can get your work done. And it should be, for people who are thinking about their workplace and how to design it, it should be a place that is different, that where you can actually get work done, right? And so you need to give your employees all of the tools they need that they can't find at Starbucks, that they can't find at home. And that's what we talk about to our clients. And it's really resonating. It's really resonating. And the last thing I'll say is it's not only about, space and technology, but it's about what's happening around the office. Location still matters when it comes to real estate. Oftentimes, and one of the most interesting things that we are trying to write about in terms of thought leadership is that the workplace can be a placemaker. There's a lot of really interesting examples of this. So we designed the Google St. John's terminal on the west side of New York. And it was in this old sort of station, right? Railway station at the end of the elevated line there. And before the neighborhood was a little run down. It just wasn't very popular. And so putting that workplace there then begins to activate the neighborhood around it, because we're then also drawing in other brands. And so that we call it outside the office amenities is another thing that employees are looking for. If you're returning to the office, well, you want to have daycare nearby. You might want to have a dry cleaners nearby. You definitely want to have a place to get coffee and have lunch and that sort of thing. So the office can be a placemaker. It can really activate parts of the city, not by itself, right? Because we all know what happened to central business districts. They became sort of this single use. And when everyone went home during the pandemic, they became ghost towns. So mixed use districts with workplace as an anchor is kind of a new trend that we're seeing that we think has a lot of potential.
That's super interesting. So I'm just thinking, Francis Hinterman, who leads thought leadership at Accenture, called out your design forecast 2025, which highlights sort of 5 trends shaping architecture and design for the year. And one of those, I'm not sure it's quite what you're saying, you tell me. I grew up in Boston. I just noticed that the first trend featured the hub on Causeway, which is where the TD garden is, the former Boston Garden where the Celtics play. Which is completely different from when we used to go there growing up, right? That has created a kind of micro environment, at least there, where folks are like going out, they're going, it's just a completely different environment than the way the old garden was
Yeah.
situated in the city. Um, Speaking of trends, a lot of these trends, as you alluded to, are kind of long burn, right? How much do these underlying trends or ideas change from year to year? And how much of what you do in terms of, to use your word, being provocative, is about bringing the insights to life with cool examples or up-to-date examples that you've worked on?
Yeah. This is a particular, so long burn trends are mostly what we're dealing with, right? So you have to think about it takes a long time for an architecture project to actually, from beginning to end, right? So we're talking years. And so that's a thing that we're constantly dealing with. Architects do talk about future-proofing buildings, and so it is in our best interest to make sure, because not only so a building might take 2 or 3 years to complete, but it's going to be there for 100 years or more if we're doing it right. And so you have to think about the future, right? So that's part of the reason we do the design forecast. And I would say, I mean, over the past 5 years, everything has been moving and changing. There's been an incredible amount of uncertainty and a lot of change, especially in the real estate market. And there's a lot of pressures that we feel that a lot of other businesses feel too, right? Extreme weather is increasing. How do you prepare and harden buildings in order to withstand that? How can you make them resilient? Um, the idea of wellness, right, is now a huge trend that is ongoing. It's not something that's new happening this year. It's been happening. And now we're seeing it morph into other things and some very specific design solutions. One new trend that we like to think we were way ahead of the game on is this idea of converting old buildings into new uses, right? So the US in particular has an old building problem. And a lot of those buildings are office buildings. And they are, nobody wants to go to an old office building. Everybody wants the workplace of the future, which is what I described earlier, right?
Yeah.
And so these buildings are going into default. They're unused. And so people are looking about how to translate or transform those or convert those into residential housing.
Mhm.
There's a great place in New York called the Pearl House that we did that in. And so it was this old building, I think, 20 stories, and we actually converted into over 500 different sort of apartment buildings. And it's doing two things. It's taking care of real estate that's going to default, and it's adding badly needed housing. There is a global housing shortage that we pay close attention to as well, which is another trend that's not new. There may be new ideas. There are new ideas about how to tackle a challenge like that. But it takes some time for these things to get going, especially when interest rates are high and it's hard to get money in the real estate sector.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just actually did a podcast interview for McKinsey yesterday on a research report that we did on affordable housing via our McKinsey Institute for Economic Mobility. And we talked a bit about adaptive reuse and the challenges of the massive housing shortfall, specifically in the United States, that it's only growing.
Yeah.
But seems like there are some concomitant challenges that need addressing that have to do with zoning reform and different kinds of policy incentives and so forth. It's a complex issue.
It's a
Um,
global issue.
You and I were talking a bit before this started about the massive trend in the emergence of data centers.
Yeah.
And I thought what you said was interesting, and we might want to talk a little bit about it there in terms of this idea of buildings being part of a larger ecosystem, spurring innovation and sort of energy and so forth. So say a little bit about this, the growth of data centers and their importance in in exemplifying that kind of innovation.
Yeah, so it's huge business, right? The demand for data has never been higher, and it's only growing, especially with generative AI, and the demand for that. And so for us in the architecture world, we are building data centers hand over fist as fast as we can, right? And this is all over the world. And before, data centers were situated on the outskirts of town. Many of them still are. But as demand increases, you want to get them closer to the population centers, and this presents its own challenges, right? And there's a lot of innovation happening around making them smaller, situating them in different places. The biggest issue across the board is the energy demand. I was just talking to one of our data center designers the other day, and she said that these are the most sustainable and energy efficient buildings on the planet because they use so much energy. And so there's like water cooling. Sometimes we use algae to help cool these massive computers. But what it's doing, what the demand for data centers is doing, is actually spurring a lot of innovation in energy generation, right? So you've got hyperscalers like Meta and Google and OpenAI that who are actually investing in different kinds of energy generation, small nuclear reactors, fusion, right? The promise of fusion we think is maybe not that far away, but also on-site energy generation, right? Which is something that architects think about a lot. And what does that mean? And so I think the reason data centers are so interesting is not, I mean, these are interesting buildings because they're so energy efficient, and I think other buildings can actually learn from what we're doing in terms of resilience to make these energy efficient. But as you said, it's part of this ecosystem, and that's our world, right? There is never just a building or a place that exists on its own in a vacuum without influencing the community or without influencing other types of design. And this is what makes our thought leadership so interesting, is that when you begin to get into the idea and the concept and the conversation around ecosystems, then that really unlocks how design can actually help and why you need design to think through these different types of buildings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super. It's like, oh, it's a very interesting thing too, that the supply and demand gap and the ways that we're looking to bridge that supply and demand gap for data centers and bringing along energy innovation at the same time could actually then benefit uh, non-data center buildings and so forth, right? Could spur
Right.
innovations that help other kinds of buildings become more energy efficient. It's super cool.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good segue to Gen AI, as a disruptor. How are you using it in your publishing shop, if at all, at Gensler? How's it changing your day to day?
Yeah, we are using it. So I will say, I will start with this. And I think we can all agree, it is not, we can't produce finished thought leadership. We can't produce finished articles 100% with Gen AI. It's just not possible. It's not possible because it's not sophisticated enough yet. And so there is a need, and a critical need, for human input. I'll just start there. We use it as a thought partner, an idea generator. We do get to outline sometimes, but just going back to something I said earlier, we're in the relationship business. You know, one of the things you asked me earlier, what was one of the things I did when I arrived, is that the architects who were writing thought leadership didn't have bylines on their articles, and and I was like, this doesn't make any sense, because part of what we're doing is we're putting forward these people. They are the face of the company. Our people are our most valuable asset. We are a professional services firm. These are the people that are talking to our clients, and they are the ones with the ideas, not me and my team. They have the ideas that we help them articulate. And so that's another reason why Gen AI is a difficult and challenging thing, is because if we used it to write their ideas, they wouldn't be able to articulate them at conferences in front of clients and that sort of thing. That's
Right.
one thing. But I actually see some other very specific uses for Gen AI.
Mhm.
If we're gonna, I think it could help us to get even more hyper local. I think it could help us scale globally,
Yeah.
which is something we're looking into. We do a lot of case studies. We produce, we have about between 100 and 150 projects that come online every year. And so the possibility that we might be able to use Gen AI to help us tell the stories of those projects in very small ways, not deep dives, but like, here was the challenge, this is what we did, and here was the impact we had. I think that could be an interesting use of Gen AI as well.
Mhm.
And we're looking into it. I know, as an architecture company, right? Like, as an architecture firm, visual assets are incredibly important. And I think the practice is using things like Midjourney to sort of rapidly iterate on concepts for clients. I think that there's a lot of that going on in our firm. So, and I think that's interesting as well.
You know, that raises an interesting point. So visual assets are important in rapidly iterating what you show to clients. How important, what kind of a premium in your thought leadership do you place on visual innovation and sort of UX, those kinds of features?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, we've got an incredible library of photography and photo
Yeah.
assets, right? So we know that when we put those front and center, and when we have like drone footage and other video footage of our projects, we can see a significant increase in engagement around those projects. So we know that format is better than just like a piece of writing. And so, but how else are we pushing the limits through UX and design? We want to do more of that. I mean, I think we are behind when it comes to UX and digital innovation. We've tried things every year, but we have a long way to go. We still Design Forecast, which is our annual trend publication, is still printed. And I was asking one of our CEOs the other day if we still needed to print it, and she was adamant. She said, "We are in the business of making artifacts. We make things real in the world, and so this is really on brand for us to actually create a physical publication." And indeed, people like it. A lot of the C-suite folks that we deal with really do like it. In many ways, the architecture and design industry is old school, right? And it takes something to sort of move us into the digital realm. I think Gen AI is probably a really good accelerator. And so we're looking at a lot of different things right now.
Well, I will say I thought your design forecast had a really nice
Yeah.
UX and look and feel, and the executive summary, which was digital. I thought it looked great.
Yeah, and we're
And so
excited.
much of it does depend on what your target audience values in terms of format, right? Like, if in
Yeah.
an audience back way right now, if your clients are still want that hard copy. I picked up one of those hard copies somewhere. It must have been at the GTLI symposium, and it was kind of beautiful.
Yeah. No, we take a lot of pride in in beauty and aesthetics for sure. But thank you for saying that. We're actually really proud of the digital version of Design Forecast that we did last year, and that was and we're in a wonderful position. Me and my team are in a wonderful position to be able to experiment with stuff like that. And so that was a total like, let's try this. I mean, it's really cool to get into a room with a bunch of smart people and say, what can we do? And we're going to do it again this year, and it'll be something different. Yeah, there is a practical, I want to stress, there's a practical side to our thought leadership that we should not sort of gloss over. A lot of developers in the real estate world are strapped and stressed, and they just want to know what to do, right? We have a huge audience that comes to us and says, like, tell me what to do, right? They have huge budgets, right? For some of the larger companies. How am I going to manage these funds if interest rates are high and and we have all this space needs, right? So we are a consulting firm, and oftentimes that just means like we just need to get real practical here. And again, it just depends. I think the data people who are in the data center market, they don't really have time. They just know that they need to get those things built.
Right. The time horizon is not that long.
Yeah.
So I'm mindful of time. I do want to get to this question from the audience. Lori Compass asked regarding thought leadership content with a small staff and so many contributors. How do you establish and maintain consistently high editorial standards? Do you offer workshops and trainings to architects and designers?
Yeah. We do. We have that is really kind of what my job has morphed into these days. I'm constantly on the phone with groups of people explaining sort of best practices for thought leadership. We have, it won't surprise you to know, we have a whole intake system and process where rather than just our inboxes filling up with finished blog posts, we actually funnel people through this intake form. We ask them to describe and pitch their ideas. And then those ideas come to our team and we talk about them as a group. And then we get back to the thought leaders and say either yes, or you should think about this, and we help them craft it. So there's a lot of one-on-one stuff going on. But generally speaking, yeah, we have regular monthly meetings with, the marketing and PR teams as a whole across the world. There's probably about 300 total. And so we have a monthly meeting explaining what we're up to, the state of thought leadership. We show our editorial calendar, which we update, which has weekly themes that we hope people adopt and write to. And so there are a lot of things in place, yes, to ensure this quality. We have a lot more work to go. But yeah, we couldn't do what we do without leveraging the regions and scaling in that way.
Okay, Sam, I could talk shop with you all day, but we are at time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Such a pleasure to be here, Lucia. Thank you so much.
That's great. And again, for more about upcoming events hosted by the GTLI, including future webinars such as these, visit the APQC website at apqc.org/GTLI. You can also subscribe to our weekly GTLI newsletter for highlights of the best thought leadership of the moment, particularly interesting during these uncertain times. And of course, follow the Global Thought Leadership Institute on LinkedIn. Have a great day or evening and be well.